Well, let's get more now on the legal dimensions to what's been happening in Gaza and other parts of the occupied Palestinian territory. And we can speak now to Professor William Schabas, who's a world-leading scholar of international criminal law and genocide. He joins us from London. Professor, thank you very much indeed for being with us here on Al Arabiya English. The United Nations Human Rights Office in Geneva saying the impediment of access to food relief for civilians in Gaza could constitute a war crime. It also goes on to describe attacks on people trying to access food as unconscionable. What's your response to that?
Well, yeah, I don't think there's much doubt really that we're talking about things that are probably war crimes. Civilians should not be targeted in any case, and the idea that you starve people for 2 months and then offer them some food, but then make it absolutely hazardous to their own lives in order to collect it is really just, it's so heartbreaking that it's hard to find words to describe it. So, you know, there should be no arms at this event. This is about providing food to hungry people, and it's not a military activity at all. So this is, you know, it will register as one of the violations of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court as a war crime, and be added, unfortunately, to a list that's rather long at this point.
Right, there are a lot of definitions out there, a lot of words being used, and you would know better than anyone I can think of which of them are apt and which are not. So we've got food as a weapon of war, ethnic cleansing, genocide. Which of those, based on what you've seen and read with regards to what's been happening in Gaza, are apt and which are not?
Well, ethnic cleansing and food as a weapon of war, these are not terms that are they're not legal terms, really. We don't find them used in that way in a convention or in a treaty, although they're very descriptive, and in that sense they provide an adequate picture of some of the things that are going on. What would be a war crime is targeting civilians. So if you're targeting civilians, or if you are being indiscriminate in your targeting so that the damage to civilians is excessive or disproportionate to any military objective, then we're talking about war crimes. As for genocide, this is a term that has been used and that has been debated now for more than a year and a half since the conflict began. I think that world public opinion, one could say, statements by politicians, by opinion leaders in various countries, is slowly moving in that direction. In my opinion, there's a very strong argument to be made that genocide has been committed, is being committed. That question is now before the International Court of Justice. It won't be adjudicated for 3-4 years from now. But again, I think that it's entirely an appropriate way to describe now the state of play in Gaza.
And you were just suggesting there, and I just want to pick up on this, that the word genocide is now becoming more common as a word to describe the situation in Gaza, in a way being normalized to describe that situation in the corridors of power around the world. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's a word that has a precise legal meaning that has been defined in judgments by international courts. It also has a word. It's a word that has a broader meaning. I think in the general public, people would understand that it's a very serious allegation, but they might not be aware of the detailed nature of the legal definition. The legal definition requires a deliberate, intentional acts aimed at physically destroying a group, and that is something that has become increasingly characteristic of this conflict, where it seems increasingly clear that the current leaders of Israel want to enlarge the borders of the country by annexing the West Bank and Gaza, that they cannot do this as long as the Palestinian population, the Arab Palestinian population, remains, because it will form the majority of any larger state that is created, and that they have to get rid of them. But as we've seen in earlier genocides, One can think of the Holocaust or the Shoah. One can think of Rwanda. The borders are in effect closed. There's nowhere for people to go. And so physical destruction is the order of the day, and we're seeing lots of evidence of that. So this is why the term is quite appropriate in a legal sense, aside from the fact that there's this apparent momentum growing for using it also in a more popular or less, in a less professional way, but simply as a way of describing horror or outrage.
Right, it's important, isn't it, that words like genocide, which are extremely significant and have a huge and tragic impact on the world, are not used too liberally, and that they should be used only after very careful consideration. And you used the word evidence just now, and I just really want to pick up on that and ask you what sorts of evidence and what form that evidence might need to take for such a thing as genocide to be proven in this particular case.
The hard part of establishing that genocide is taking place has often, maybe even generally, been proving what we call the genocidal intent. That is, that the acts are committed, acts of persecution, of violence, acts that are motivated by racism, have this additional element of the desire or the intent to physically destroy the group. And there often we have very little direct evidence of it. We draw conclusions, we draw inferences from conduct, and we say, well, it could have no other, there could be nothing else could explain that conduct. But this is very hard to do. It's like proving circumstantial evidence in any criminal trial at an ordinary level for a murder or some other crime. But what we have here, and I think for me this was the tipping point in being convinced that we're talking about genocidal crimes, was that the statements at the highest level in Israel of leaders who were talking about both about demonizing the people of Palestine by suggesting that they were all the enemy or that they're all terrorists, and also statements like the most notorious is perhaps the one that Yoav Gallant made very early in the conflict in October of 2023, where he said, we're going to cut off all food, all electricity, all potable water, all medical care. This can have no other consequence but the destruction of a group. And there have been many statements since then, extreme views, but by people at the highest levels in the Israeli government, and they haven't stopped. There are still more recent examples. They continue.
Okay, you mentioned Yoav Gallant, but are there other people, if so, who, with whom you think the buck stops with regards to these events in Gaza?
Well, the buck obviously stops with Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, unless we think that it really stops with Donald Trump. But at the highest level in Israel, obviously it's with him, and he has made coalitions with, the people with the most extreme views are people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir. But there have been others, and I can't list the names, I don't have them at my fingertips, but there have been other statements like this that have been reported in the media and that reflect this. It's a very unusual thing. We didn't even have this in Nazi Germany, where the leaders stand up and say, well, we have a plan to exterminate the population. But extreme statements of that nature, of course, coupled with what is at the most charitable, this indifference to the lives of the civilian population and the blending, shall we say, or the treatment of the civilian population as if they're all combatants, which they clearly are not. There was I think in the media, I heard reported earlier today, an explanation given by the IDF, by the Israeli armed forces, for the attacks on the people in the food distribution. And they were saying, well, they didn't attack the people who were there getting the food, but some people were in a zone where they weren't supposed to be and they were attacked. But you don't attack people just because they're in the wrong zone. You can only attack under international law people who are directly participating in combat. And there was no such allegation. So it's this absolute indifference to the people of Gaza, to their institutions, the destruction of all the universities and the hospitals. I could go on. It's massive, and it's very hard to find anything equivalent, certainly in modern times.
Okay, so were the conflict to stop tomorrow, what would be the next steps with regards to bringing those responsible to justice, as you see it? What would happen next?
Well, if the conflict is to stop, I think that, you know, there's got to be a political consequence, which needs to be at some point the actual creation of a Palestinian state. In theory, of course, Israel should prosecute its own soldiers and its leaders for the violations, but it's not likely to do that. And there are, of course, the alternatives, which are international institutions or countries having their courts prosecute these crimes under what we call the principle of universal jurisdiction. But this also depends on taking the perpetrators into custody. So I think the idea that there'll be individual responsibility for all these crimes, there may be some at some point, but I think we're looking long into the future for all of this to come about. There may be some Israeli leaders who travel and then, without anticipating what the consequences, get picked up and have some state that's willing to prosecute them. But I think that will be very much an exception, and it will depend a bit on serendipity rather than on any organized plan. Of course, one could say that there should be a peace agreement that would also contemplate the prosecution on both sides, by the way, for war crimes, violations of international law that are committed. I think that would be unlikely, and making that maybe a condition for a peace plan might make the peace agreement much more difficult to negotiate as well. And I don't know whether that's a desirable outcome.
Right, and people in Israel would say surely Hamas bears a huge part of the responsibility as well. So where would they fit into a ruling at an international level with regards to, for example, the crime of genocide?
Well, Hamas, I don't think there's a serious allegation that Hamas has committed genocide, although there were a few claims made very early in the conflict that was what was going on. I don't see that playing out. But, you know, of the people who were charged at the International Criminal Court, for example, there were 3 Hamas leaders and 2 Israeli leaders. It's become very clear that there are secret or sealed indictments or charges we call them arrest warrants at the International Criminal Court. And I think it's reasonable to expect that there are some Hamas leaders who are contemplated by those as well. So I don't think anybody seriously questions the idea that there should be prosecutions on both sides. I think that since October of 2023, the balance as to who's responsible for all of this has gradually the crimes of Hamas on the 7th of October 2023 have become more and more, the reaction has been more and more disproportionate from Israel. And I think, let me just add one other point about this, and I think this is relevant also to the conclusion about genocidal intent, is that Israel has not been very successful either at defeating Hamas or at liberating the hostages, which it claimed were the reasons for its very, very harsh and brutal military intervention. And is that because they're a failure at doing it, or is it because they're not trying very hard to do that? That really these are nothing more than pretexts for what amount to attacks on the Palestinian people, with the objective of clearing out that territory so that it can be annexed by Israel.
And just lastly, Professor Schabas, I mean, how do you think history is going to look back on this chapter? Let's say 20, 30 years from now, people look back at the events of 2023, 24, 25. What are they going to say about us?
People will look back in horror at how this could take place. Not just the injustice towards the Palestinians, not just this brutal conflict that has gone on now for almost 2 years, but the fact that, you know, they were promised a state, in effect, an independent state in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, when the mandate was being assigned to the United Kingdom over the territory of Palestine. They were promised it by the United Nations General Assembly in 1947, when it was decided what to do with the territory. And they're still waiting. We have people now, 4 and 5 generations of refugees, and we look upon this as one of the great failings of our international system. It already is.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Professor William Schabas, thank you.